by saying that justice is an extremely loaded term. And I think the way we look at justice in a lot of this, particularly with regard to the ICT and the discussions with regard to Shahbag, initially, of course, we're talking about punitive or retributive measures, right? So we're talking about trial procedures. And trials in and of themselves are extremely problematic because there is an individualization of criminality. That's one level. There's overt focus on the perpetrators, and the criticism is there's not enough focus on the victims. With regard to questions of war crimes accountability, I think the magnitude of these crimes are so beyond belief and so beyond human imagination that you will never be able to seek appropriate justice for example, the question of refugees, or for the question of, massacres, or with questions about genocide or acts of genocide or crimes against humanity and war crimes. So the fact of the matter is, at the least, you will always do, and which is what each of the cases, whether you talk about the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda or International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, and those were in the 1990s, those were ad hoc tribunals that the UN started trying to work its way through. And if you go back, of course, you can talk about the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials, and they were extremely problematic as well. But between that and ICTR and ICTY, there was this huge gap because of this thing called Cold War. But I think for the most part, even if you look at something like the extraordinary chambers of the extraordinary courts of the chambers of Cambodia, which is running right now, or if you talk about Sierra Leone, the special courts of Sierra Leone, they're all focused on emblematic cases. At the end of the day, you can only try a few handfuls, right? You can only try and find enough evidence that you can present before a court of law, that where you can collect the kind of witnesses that you want, you will be able to prosecute and be able to get a judgment. And so whatever you are looking for, it will never be sufficient in terms of what you're looking for with regards to this larger question of justice. So these emblematic cases, whether they are 5 or 6, Ian Sari, I think, and Nuonchea with regard to ECCE, and then 3 or 4 others. And so with regard to Cambodian genocide, it's 1.5 million dead. Those 5 or 4 individuals couldn't have been the only ones responsible. In the case of the Sikh genocide, it's the same question. In the case of Bangladesh, it's the same question. These 5 or 6 individuals are not the only ones responsible, but these are the ones that we can try in a court of law, and we can provide the most amount of evidence. That's one aspect of it. There's also the question of, well, what does justice actually mean with regard to the victims? Are you looking for financial compensation? How would you actually calculate that, especially when you have a huge amount of time that has passed, and this is something that has never been properly resolved. Victims will always demand and must demand more. There's a larger question of reparations, which is broader than the question of financial compensation. Now, the reparations could be community-based, could be based with regard to, whether rebuilding of infrastructure or, restitution. And these are all dependent upon the kind of infrastructures and mechanisms you actually put in place, whether the United Nations is involved or the ICTJ, which obviously with the industrialization of transitional justice mechanisms is always there, and in terms of the capacity of the local government. In any of these cases, if you look at it from the point of defense, right, whether you talk about the success of the Sierra Leone case or the failure of the Dili courts in East Timor, you always have to talk about the fact that the defense will always say, are these courts only about prosecution or are they about justice? And that's a very fundamental question defense will always ask, because of course the defense is about the position of those individuals who are being tried before the court of law. With the ICT case, in regard to Bangladesh, by saying that we are only going to try individuals who are criminals in a court of law, they have already precluded, they have always precluded this discussion of the larger notions of justice, right? So this question you raise about truth commissions or truth and reconciliation commissions, that was never brought up, partly because at that time in the 1970s, we did not have much knowledge even in the international system of what these things were about. You go back with regard to truth and reconciliation commissions, and those are problematic as well. They were tried in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Peru, etc., etc. And then, of course, the most famous, as I'm sure most of you have heard, is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The most popular by far, when you talk to anybody who's talking about post-conflict negotiations, is because they provided blanket amnesty practically to all individuals involved, right? So the South African model that is upheld is also the most problematic because the punitive measures or the questions about justice is not held. There are other measures. I think this question of banning Jamaat or, for for example, invoking the citizenship of Ghulam Azam, it now becomes this question of targeting individuals and removing them from political processes rather than criminalizing an entire group, right, in terms of their institutional or cultural, religious, ideological affiliation. So there are broader questions with regard to justice. If you stick with the only punitive measures, we are stuck with the absolute inevitable fault lines that come with the courts of law, and they will never be perfect. So a lot of it depends upon the will of the national government, in this case, of course, the Indian government, as you would say. Who wants a piece of the pie? Is this, if a punitive measure or a truth and reconciliation measure is not popular, either in the region or in the larger politics of the international system with a capital P, the progress that a national government can actually make with regard to support, with regard to finances, with regard to institutional capacity, it gets very limited. So I think you're absolutely right to critique ICT, but you also have to understand the context within which it has emerged and the fact that it has been trying and it has felt completely isolated at some points, criticized in others, and rightly so in many ways. But this question of justice will keep on going back way after the ICT is done, because for the vast majority of people, questions of memory, questions of rights, questions of entitlement will not go away. So I'll end it.
Let's rephrase the questions that were raised. I think the chairs away, but we have to stand. And people who work here do not get overtime. So for the sake of workers' rights and so their solidarity, we should definitely move out soon. But the questions I think coming from all the questions and comments here, I want to rephrase those questions for the remainder of time in two questions. One is in terms of limitations of Shahbag movement in both in terms of its bourgeois nature, or maybe it's sort of too close of alignment without AL and sort of being not being critical enough, not being critical, and then just raising questions of credibility. So that's one set of questions. And the second set of questions is, I think a lot of us were hopefully asking that in what way Shahbag can actually move beyond this sort of a limited beginning and represent something larger. So we're asking Shahbag in one way to sort of be credible on its demands, but also in some way we're asking it to be moved beyond and go somewhere else. So these are the possibilities, I think, I presented two questions. So I would actually, at this time, I'm going to come back reverse order. So I'm going to start from Asghar Hussain and come back down the line, everybody having about 2 minutes and ending with 9.
So I have only a minute to deal with these two very serious, loaded questions. Well, I will take up the second question and try to be very brief. Actually, I think the question surrounding the possible revival of the Shahbag movement, which assumes that the movement has been on the end. Yeah, it's an important question. It is an important question for anyone who is interested in, in a better Bangladesh, if you will. So I would put it very bluntly and briefly. The Shahbag activists need to intervene at this particular conjuncture, which is to do with government workers. At this conjuncture, need to intervene not only at the level of humanitarian efforts that are ongoing, commendably ongoing, but also political. If the Shahbag movement can reconfigure its own agendas in relation to the interests of the people who have just suffered right now, of the people who have been killed, workers. So if that can happen, if the students, young people can work side by side with workers, side by side with peasants in Bangladesh, then it will be a new thing also. And then there will be possible, or possible road to some kind of transformation. I don't see any other alternative, as far as I'm concerned, to intervene at this specific conjuncture in terms of, being in its garments movements, garment workers movement. And I should also point out that the movement of the garment workers is right now brewing, even it's kind of spreading. So if the Shahbag movement can, respond to this, and be part of this in some ways. So there is a possibility. After all is said and done, there is no transformation. There is no possibility of this transformation of Bangladesh without transforming the lives of the majority of the people there. the toiling masses, the peasants, and the proletariat who actually constitute this entire country to a great extent. And of course, there are oppressed nations, women's questions. We have all forms and forces of oppression and exploitation. It is important that we address that to the extent that we can, comprehensively and interconnectedly.
This is great, because this is the point I didn't get to make when I was talking. Okay, so, all this time we've been trying to analyze and critique Shahbag and looking at the movement itself, but it's so important to look at the institutional context within which the movement operates. Here are the people, here is the movement, and here are the institutions. When people mobilize, they interact with institutions, they interact with the government. So essentially, our institutional structure shapes in a lot of ways how things develop. And let me break this down a little bit really quickly. First of all, Shahbag, we've been looking at it from the lens of social movements, from various different perspectives, but we cannot really do that because a lot of the social movement literature talks about movements as if they were, able to develop freely and, develop really out of the Western context. But Bangladesh is not, even if we have, elections and we have transitioned into parliamentary democracy in 1991, we're not really a democracy. At best, we're an electoral authoritarian regime. We have elections, but the parties are repressive. So, but at the same time, we cannot really call our system totally authoritarian because the parties could not crush Shahbag as if they would in an authoritarian regime because they would lose elections in December. So essentially, this is different. This is unique. It's a movement in an electoral authoritarian regime, which very few people have, which very little work and research has addressed. And we have to think of it in a new way. We cannot put the burden of this entirely on the movement. We have to think strategically about how to counteract, how to both mobilize our people and target the system and work within the system.
Well, I'm glad that the question of violence of the minorities had been brought forth. And in last 2 months after the emergence of the Shahbag, the 526 Hindu temples have been vandalized. So that was one of the kind of political reaction against the Shahbag. But that being said, I want to, one of the most important thing about the Shahbag that it actually resubstantiated the political discourse as some sort of more emancipatory, but still nonetheless a form of nationalism, which is capable of holding different groups and different identities in the same body. So what Shahbag did, I think, is kind of construction of a semi-universality. Okay, of course, having what I call this fidelity to the event of 1971 working as a determining factor. It provided a narrative, but this political discourse that is capable of actually incorporating the minorities, the ethnic and religious minorities. Of course, there have been a lot of talk about a particular slogan in the Shahbag movement, which actually kind of resurrected the slogan that was used in 1971, which means that who are you, who are me, It's like Bengali, Bengali. So that was like very kind of, in some way, it was very, alarming, particularly because of the ethnocentrism that the slogan has carried. But nonetheless, I think within the Shahbag movement, there is a possibility, and that it did happen, the ethnic minorities have been incorporated in the movement. Well, I'm not talking about the sociological fact that it happened, but I'm talking about the political discourse, and the formation of the political discourse. In the Shahbag movement, I think it is possible, theoretically possible, to incorporate these other ethnic and minorities in a political platform. And going back to the question of Hefazat-e-Islami, which is of course very significant political development, and insofar as they are kind of a political reaction against Shahbag, by reaction I'm not necessarily saying they're like counter-generative, but it's a reaction, but it happens to be a counter-generative one, and their kind of political discourse or their construction of the people, if we look at their demands and their, not only demands, but their performative acts, it is like kind of regenerating or resubstantiating this kind of communitarian identity as a formation of the polity, as a founding basis of the polity. So I think this question, this violence on the minorities and this two contesting narrative will remain, and it will shape our politics in the coming days. And as for the question that Afrosan raised, I absolutely agree with his optimism that Shahbag movement and the RMD workers are getting united. But one of those kind of very noticeable absent in the Shahbag movement was these RMD workers, who are undoubtedly the most politically radical agents in the Dhaka city, and even in this whole subcontinent. But why they were absent? I think part of the reason is that the Shahbag movement, the presupposition that it has.
Moving
30 seconds.
Sure.
Yet the presupposition that Shahbag movement has, this kind of participation in the national political life, And that all that it requires. I mean, the R&D workers are structurally unable to participate in that national political life. So, of course, I think the humanitarian intervention and other things will continue, but I don't really see any possibility of a political, merging between these two. Well, as much as I hope.
There lies the challenge, actually. I was
Yeah.
speaking of that particular challenge.
Yeah, we of course hope that, but probably.
Well, I will not say.
Mic is on.
Mic is on? Okay. So I see the possibility of Shahbag is in transformation. Of course, I agree to my fellow panelists. But how we transform Shahbag, actually? I think, as one of our audience, one person from the audience said, that there is no debate between the panelists. Yeah, it is actually, we are reproducing what happened in the Shahbag. We had actually different ideas and different strategies, different beliefs, but we actually put it down to get the major goal, that actually the fair justice. But we still know that the trial is still on, and what happens after the trial is over, the tribunal is over, and all the verdicts are out, then only the Shahbag movement will take a different phase, fight against other Shahbagians.